Welcome to Swiss Institute on the occasion of Sam Lewitt's exhibition, Less Light, Warm Words. We're thrilled tonight to be joined by Jason W. Moore for our very last public programme at 18 Worcester Street. So thank you all for coming, and thank you to everyone who has joined us for public programmes while we've been at this location. We hope you enjoy the lecture this evening on the subject of the capitalogenic world. Jason W. Moore is a historical geographer and world historian at Binghamton University, where he is Associate Professor of Sociology and Research Fellow at the Fernand Braudel Center. Among other publications in a variety of languages, he is the author of Capitalism in the Web of Life, published by Verso 2015, and he is also the editor of Anthropocene or Capitalocene, Nature, History, and the Crisis of Capitalism. He writes frequently on the history of capitalism, environmental history, and social theory. Moore is presently completing Ecology and the Rise of Capitalism, an environmental history of the rise of capitalism, and 7 Cheap Things, a world ecological manifesto, which he is writing with Raj Patel, both to be published by the University of California Press. He is coordinator of the World Ecology Research Network. So please join me in giving a warm welcome to Jason W. Moore.
Thank you. What a pleasure it is to be here. What an honor it is to be here at the Swiss Institute. And having met Sam Lewitt, I'm tremendously excited. I've been reading his interviews and reading what he's been writing. And this fits in very powerful ways with what we are calling the world ecology conversation, which is not a theory, not a perspective, not a line, but a way of thinking that takes the questions of power, nature, and capital seriously as entwined realities and entangled realities and messy realities. And with Donna Haraway, I would invoke that we must all live with the trouble. And the trouble is already in the title here, which is a misspelled world, which indeed seems to sum up the matter of our capitalogenic world. At least you know this is a more or less fresh talk. And so let's begin with some of the obvious. The news is not so good on planet Earth. This is the one of these visual imaginaries that sticks with us of the planetary thresholds, work pioneered by Johan Rockström of the Stockholm Resilience Center. This really embodies the way of thinking of the Earth system scientists, and lest anyone think that I'm down on them, I think they do great work. But this is the imaginary we have of the crisis on the planet today, and this rules out quite a bit. This is an imaginary of the biosphere is somehow outside us. It rules out the questions of financialization, of homelessness, of precariousness, of hunger, of poverty, of all these human questions that are in fact absolutely central to these questions of planetary boundaries. Here are more. It's really not good. Here are the hockey stick graphs. We get these all the time. This is the planetary crisis, and we must rally around a particular managerial, technocratic, bureaucratic solution embodied by the Anthropocene discourse. The sort of anti-politics machine of the Anthropocene is deep and infects, I would say, even the left that says, look, this is all that's important. But no. Really, here's the 6th extinction. And this gives us a little visual representation of how many percentage of species are threatened with mass extinction. What's rarely pointed out in this discussion is, of course, that the 6th extinction isn't anything like the 5 previous extinctions on planet Earth. It's not the work of an asteroid. It's not the work of methane release. It is the work of capital. It is a capitalogenic process. It is not anthropogenic, and that's something that I really want to walk through and reflect about and argue about and discuss over the course of the next hour and then into our discussion is how do we think of the agents, how do we think of the relations, how do we think of the processes that are transforming not only the biosphere as a whole, but also human nature, and how do we understand human and extra-human nature as fundamentally connected. So what I'm going to go through is to deal with these 3 big questions of planetary crisis today. Who and what caused this? When and where did this begin, and how did we get here? And this might sound banal, but how we answer these questions absolutely shapes the kinds of politics that we choose. And so one of the arguments that I've been making lately is that this is a kind of politics that I've called the anti-politics of the Anthropocene, which of course translates to age of man. Kate Raworth's phrase, the Manthropocene, seems particularly appropriate. The panel of geologists who have been weighing this question of the Anthropocene, the age of man, are, of course, almost all men. But this is also the most powerful environmentalist concept of the past 15 years, the Anthropocene. And not for nothing, we have The Economist magazine, the great mouthpiece of British imperialism, telling us, well, welcome to the Anthropocene. And here I want to pause just a moment for this visual, which is a very strange representation of planet Earth. It's very mechanical. It looks a little bit to me like the Death Star here, floating around. That this is not an accidental representation, I think, in the popular imaginary. And so what's the message? This is David Cameron, the now happily ex-prime minister. We're all in this together. People who say this always seem to be, have 20 million pounds or dollars in the bank or more. 20 million is nothing, as we know these days. But this is what they always say. This is one of the most powerful messages of environmentalism since the 1970s. I think that it's done some good. But it says, well, we're all in this together. And I think we need to really think about that kind of meta-narrative, that kind of profound narrative that shapes our politics, that the anthropos, humanity, humans are doing it, and then it conjures up nice and fuzzy images. Of course, these are precisely the examples of human beings who have historically been excluded from the category of humanity in the modern world, of humanity with an uppercase H. And I'll return to this later in the talk, but it's very important to understand that the language of nature and society and humanity and society is not merely an analytical problem that affects how we see the world. It is, in fact, one of the foundations upon which the modern world is built. That is the exclusion of the vast majority, historically, of human beings from membership in society, of indigenous peoples, of Africans, of almost all women, even many white people historically were expelled from humanity. This was indeed a condition of capitalist development from the era of Columbus to the present. And of course, this has been widely contested, and I think somebody like Nancy Fraser has really advanced our thinking about boundary struggles around that. That's absolutely central around whose lives matter, whose work matters, and I would extend that to whose work matters in the web of life, that it's not just human beings who do work. I was really struck by this, which gives us a visual representation of the God trick of modern environmentalist thinking that sees planet Earth from the outside. And then I like this metaphor because it's so horrible. It's so horrifying. We're all crew. Well, it's interesting because the origins, one of the sources of the modern proletariat was, of course, precisely in the sailors that manned the great ocean-going ships that propelled the rise of capitalism and sustained industrial capitalism all the way from the Manila galleons running silver back and forth between the Americas and Manila to ocean-going containers in the present era. We're all crew. It's a very peculiar kind of statement. It's the human juggernaut. It's our anthropogenic world. What are anthropogenic factors? There is a whole kind of vast and deep mythology that tells us, well, it's all human-made. And yes and no, of course. Of course, there are human beings, there are particular human beings doing this, but it tends to forget about these guys. And yeah, I do mean guys. So this is a cartoon from the era of the Pullman strike in the United States in the early 1890s. But I think we need to be very clear that the language of humanity and also the political practice of the concept of humanity in making the material world and in symbolic worlds and how they fit together, that language has been saturated with a profound violence. And I don't just mean symbolic violence. I mean the blood and violence of capitalist development, of colonialism, and all the rest of it. So we should ask, well, is the driver of today's biospheric crisis really best considered as anthropogenic? And for me, I believe radicals have done two things really well. We have named the system. And we need to name the system. The system is not humanity. The system is capitalism. And we have spoken truth to power. And so there are all these people who say, well, why don't we just use the language of Anthropocene and anthropogenic and a whole host of other ways of representing the world that really are inherited from bourgeois civilization to then go and fix all the problems. Well, the thing is that they're not just ideas. They are ideas that are endowed with real material force. And even Marx had this argument. And we might remember from the early on in Marx's life, he talks about how ideas too become material forces when seized by the masses. But also, of course, ideas have the origins of modern science, of the classification of life on this planet, of ways of mapping life in this world, have been absolutely material forces in making the world that we have today. So in other words, the thinking that gets us into the crisis is unlikely to deliver it from us. That this is not about language per se, but about language and ways of thinking. So what I'm very concerned about is a profound ahistorical sensibility in much of environmentalist thought. And this has, of course, been remedied by environmental historians. But the weakness and the strength of environmental history has been that it is captive to a regional imagination, that we still too rarely put nature into our thinking about how capitalism as a system of power, of production, of reproduction, of violence, has nature at its core in multiple registers, symbolic and material, and in the very powerful ways of the symbolic and the material become entangled such that it's no easier to sort those two things out than it is to sort society and nature out, or humans and the rest of nature out, that we are always and at every turn entangled and bundled with and within each other. And so what I'm very concerned about, and the Anthropocene conversation really brings this home, is this kind of startling lack of historical thinking in environmentalist thought and action and politics, and that's opened the door to a resurgence of a very old argument, which is to say, well, it all begins in England with the Industrial Revolution right around 1800 and coal and steam, and now you have other scholars who come in and say, well, of course there's class struggle and that was a big deal. And look, this was hugely important. Nobody argues the significance of the Industrial Revolution. The argument is this the when and where of the world ecological crisis of the 21st century? And the answer flatly is no. There is a deep and profound history of how power and production and reproduction, of how capital was organized around how landscapes were organized, that began in the age of Columbus. And to be clear, 1492 is not over. We are still living in the era of 1492. The question is, how do we get beyond that? And that is going to require a radically multi-species, anti-colonial, feminist, and anti-racist approach to liberation and emancipation. And that's going to require a whole series of unthinking and unraveling of the legacy of Columbus broadly conceived. And that's a bit of what I'm going to talk about today. That is the origins of capitalogenesis. And let's remind ourselves, too, that the Industrial Revolution thesis was absolutely savaged over the past 2 decades as the exemplar of the most Eurocentric kinds of thinking around, and yet what we are seeing now is its recuperation, even by parts of the left who want to say, well, no, it all began there, and so on and so forth. And what we need to look at is not just capitalogenesis in a kind of simple causation kind of way, like, oh, it's the capitalists who did it, it's the good guys and the bad guys. Look, that's part of the story. There were a lot of bad guys, and they went and killed a lot of people and took their wealth and took their land and destroyed life in all different kinds of ways. And I'm going to talk some about that. But it's also about a logic. It's about a logic of environment making. And I think that we need to shift in our thinking from seeing the environment and nature as just out there. No, it is always made, and not only by humans, but every human act of inequality, of power, of violence is premised on our ability to access different parts of nature, tools, and non-human animals, and our ability to, human beings' ability to wield power over others is always dependent on the rest of nature. And because human beings are particularly powerful symbol-making species, that symbolic violence is always wrapped into that process. And that process of symbolic violence cannot be reduced to questions of superstructure or ideology. Indeed, many of the most profound developments in the history of the modern world have been around representation. I don't need to tell this audience that, I would imagine. But it is a problem in the kind of radical critique of global environmental change, that the questions of representation of symbolic power are excised from the discussion. And so the apocalypse is coming, is a way to wipe out the questions of culture, to set aside the questions of history and say, no, we're in a planetary emergency, the end times are coming, we need to take action now. And it has, I think, encouraged a particularly virulent form of sectarianism, both in radical environmentalists, but also in other environmentalists who want to preserve the notion that they have identified a sacred object, nature, and they're going to protect it. And what I want to say is that we need a radical agenda, an emancipatory agenda without sacred objects, that we need emancipation to be emancipation for all life, not one part at a time. So this is expressive of what I would call left catastrophism. And left catastrophism isn't about recognizing that there are many, many catastrophes in the world that are going on, catastrophes of human nature. We read, it seems daily, of bombings in the Middle East and everywhere else, of catastrophes of extra-human nature, of wildlife, of forests, and all the rest of this. Yes, the catastrophes exist, and indeed they are the point of departure or one point of departure for the radical critique. But there is a kind of left catastrophism that's really embodied by the Political Journal Monthly Review, but has many different forms, including forms of the center as well as of the left, in which there's a kind of waiting for the end times. Of course, this has a very long history in American political life, going all the way back to the Shakers in the 18th century and probably earlier. The Americans especially like to talk about the end of existence, the end of the world, everything else. But there's a problem. One of the problems is that we still, because in part of the influence of left catastrophism, we don't have a sense of how capital accumulation, which is really the gravitational center, it doesn't determine everything, but it's the gravitational center of the world that we live in. It's a kind of vortex, it's a kind of black hole, that we don't have a sense of how that works through the web of life. You'll read many radicals talking about the logic of capitalism, which is somehow over here in this human reductionist ether, then going over here to do terrible things to the birds and the bees and the forests and the soils and the climate and all the rest of it. All right, so this leads to very peculiar kinds of conclusions, like barring a political revolution, which of course I'm in favor of, capitalism will continue until the last tree is cut. This is a paraphrase from the German Greens, but that's very problematic because as anyone who studies what capitalists actually do, they're very concerned about where is the next batch of trees that are cheap and available, or where are they going to come from, or cheap barrels of oil, or these days cheap water, et cetera, and that there is no necessary connection between environmental change and accumulation crisis, which strikes me as quite peculiar, because even mainstream economic historians regularly report on how great booms in the modern world, great economic booms, tend to produce the underproduction of raw materials and so on and so forth. So there's a kind of a reincarnation of a breakdown theory of the world that had a lot of currency in the 19-teens and 20s and has been roundly criticized. A kind of capitalism would break down of its own sort of economic contradictions, which is, of course, a silly idea because economic contradictions are always wrapped up with political life and social change and all the rest of it. But this is the whole biosphere is going to break down, and we're all going to die. And this is the argument here. And then if you challenge that, it seems like, well, you're really minimizing the severity of the problems. Well, no, but even if we go back to that diagram of the sixth great extinction, the figures for the loss of life are much, much lower than what we saw in the KT boundary and in other powerful moments of the other five extinctions. So there's a kind of catastrophism that is using the idea of catastrophism of catastrophe to organize crisis rather than taking catastrophes which are real and powerful as points of departure to see where are the weaknesses, where are the contradictions, where are the vulnerabilities in the way that capitalism as a system of power, nature, and capital are put together. And those vulnerabilities, those contradictions, that's the stuff of politics. So we need a politics in the here and now that says, here are the weak points of capitalism and in the web of life, and that is the intellectual task because it's so vitally important to our everyday political actions. Here I would think of movements for all their problems grouped around food justice and food sovereignty, because we are living at a moment of the breakdown of capitalism's capacity to deliver more and more food with less and less labor, and that has to do with a lot of different factors. One of them is climate change, one of them is the toxicity of industrial agriculture, but another is that there is now a widespread sensibility, a consciousness that says that food just doesn't work if we break it into these parts of economic price and social equality and dealing with climate change and all the rest of it. That in order to deal with an era of widespread hunger and climate change and inequality, we need to have a politics of food that sees democracy and sustainability and justice and cultural determination all wrapped up with each other, that they are all intrinsic to each other. And so what we need to do is to engage or be aware of a historical way in which capitalism has developed that allows us to see where it is weakest and where it is strongest in the present moment. And I think that has everything to do with politics. So what I would say is that the Anthropocene has really through the back door brought into center stage in world politics and environmentalist discourse this question of the transition, of the origins of the modern world or capitalism or industrial society, whatever you want to call it. Where and when did it start? And the virtue of an older Marxist tradition was to say, look, politics, class struggles, colonialism, political economy, these are absolutely central. Now, what they didn't do such a great job around was the question of nature. And that's a real weakness. Where the Greens have done very well is to say, look, this origin of modernity, in their view, often the Industrial Revolution, this was a powerful moment of environmental change and not merely economic and social change. So what we need to do in a way is to put both halves of that amulet back together and or put them together for the first time. So this means, but in order to do so, you have to fundamentally unthink how environmentalist approaches to ecological crises have unfolded, and how the environmentalist read of biospheric problems take shape in a way of thinking that I've called the consequentialist bias. And that consequentialist bias says we're going to look at the consequences first, then we're going to look at the social drivers, and then we're going to add it all up. So I've also called this green arithmetic. You take environmental consequences, social drivers, you end up with historical change. I think that that's a problem for a lot of reasons. One of them is that all the social drivers that are identified, industrialization, urbanization, agricultural transformation, agricultural and green revolutions, changes in class structure, for the Malthusians, it's population, but all of those social or human factors are, of course, irreducibly socio-ecological. They cannot be reduced to social drivers, and yet they customarily are. And maybe for a while, maybe for a few decades even after the origins of recent environmental studies took shape in the 1970s, for a few decades, I think maybe that was okay. But today we have to understand that it's not just that capitalism has an environmental history, but that capitalism fundamentally is a system of environment making that goes through all those relations that we normally think of as social, the cultural and social and economic and industrial technological moments. These are all wrapped up in a way of organizing nature. Now, when I say that phrase, right away you think, well, capitalism doesn't just decide on what's going on in the web of life, which is totally true. But the imaginary of the modern world, the imaginary of capitalism, if you want to understand the absurdity of capitalism, you have to, as Marx argues in Capital, you have to see like capital. And you have to see how crazy this is, because the governing conceit of capitalism, of empires, has been that, well, we can do with nature as we please. And by the way, this is at the core of the Anthropocene discourse, of the Earth System Scientist discourse, the embrace of geoengineering, the embrace of technology as a way of saying, well, the technology has been used to fuck up nature, but now we're going to use the same thinking to get it right. And that's really at the core of Anthropocene thinking. And I think that it's inescapable. So for me, I would say, okay, green arithmetic, that was okay for its times, the 70s, 80s, 90s, early 2000s. I think that there was a lot of absolutely necessary work that said, okay, look, there's an environmental history of urbanization, industrialization, colonialism, all of that. So this is the environmental history of program, but we can now go further. And for this, as I often do, I like to go to Marx. Not that I think Marx got everything right, I don't, but I think he got this really, really, really right. And this is my gloss on what you can go and check out on your own, the first page of Marx's account of the labor process in Capital. And he says, human beings affect a triple transformation when they work. They transform themselves, they transform other human beings, the relations between them and other human beings, and they transform nature as a whole. And if we take seriously that proposition of a triple transformation, that completely unravels the customary social science and humanities approach to thinking about history and how humans fit in it. Because it says that every moment of human action, every moment of social action is connected with a triple transformation of that acting unit. Maybe it's, instead of an individual, it's a civilization, it's a firm, it's an empire, and that it affects it affects other humans, and it affects nature as a whole. And I would add in there, very much in the spirit of Marx, that it affects how we think about nature. And I think nature, just to echo Raymond Williams, is not only the most complex word in the English language, I think it's also the most dangerous word. And so we're going to get to that as we go through. So what we need to do is we need to have a sense and a way of thinking around the very real catastrophes of human and extra-human nature that are unfolding today, that take seriously the processes of class, capital, empire, race, gender, and so forth, as in a genuinely multi-species sense. We need to stop drawing lines around what forms of life, whose lives get emancipated first and whose don't. And I think that is one of the crucial lessons of socialism in the 20th century, is to stop doing that around different humans. Like early 20th century socialists said, women have to wait, people of color have to wait, the colonial world has to wait. And as we learned, that did not work. We need an emancipatory program that goes far beyond a human exemptionalism that says human liberation is the only ones that count, because the domination of nature, any program for the domination of nature leads to profoundly anti-egalitarian tendencies within human organizations. So what I and others in the world ecology conversation have done is said, well, we need to move beyond this green arithmetic, this consequentialist bias, this ping pong of the economic and the environmental. That makes sense up to a point, but it doesn't get us to the real core of the process. And so what we emphasize in world ecology as a very open-ended conversation is how do we link up these questions of the endless accumulation of capital, endless economic growth, with the ceaseless transformation of the earth, and that these are always connected, and that this gives us a more historical and more dialectical way of understanding the present moment. And by the way, when I say dialectical, I don't just mean, oh, they're related. No, I mean that the conditions for the transcendence of capitalism and its domination of the earth and the domination of the bourgeoisie of the earth, the conditions for the transcendence of that is wrapped up in how it organizes human and extra-human nature, that they are dialectically joined, that these are two moments with one process. And so what we can see, and here I'm going to spend the second half of this talk really walking us through something that has been almost entirely obscured and hidden from view, which is the audacious, extraordinary environment-making revolution of early capitalism. That the landscape and environmental and human transformations of the centuries between 1450 and 1750 were as audacious, as significant a moment of environment making in human history as any since the dawn of agriculture and the rise of the first cities. Only this revolution in the 16th and 17th centuries occurred in a radically compressed time frame. And that's part of what I think that we need to come to grips with when we often chalk up the present crisis to, say, industrialization and the burning of fossil fuels. That industrialization in the large-scale industry sense of that term from 1800 to the present is indeed wrapped up with fossil capitalism. Fossil capitalism is not a poor way of thinking, but we need to remind ourselves that history doesn't work by means of sharp breaks, that you always have layers within layers. We live simultaneously in the era of agrarian and fossil and finance capital all at once, and that indeed, that layering forms part of the opportunity and also part of the absolute dreadfulness of the present conjuncture. So when I say, well, capitalism is a world ecology, I'm not talking about the ecology of the world. I'm talking about a way of seeing of civilizations in which the production and reproduction, questions of power, questions of nature, are always bundled up together, and in which nature is always co-produced, which means that, yes, humans make environments, but those environments make humans. And that is, in the present moment, a dramatically non-linear relationship. And that's one of the things that we do need to keep in mind when we think of the realities of climate change. It's not just the reports of the climate scientists that give us this sometimes terrifying sense of the non-linearity of accelerating climate change. That's real enough. But we need to understand that one of the ways that capitalism has worked over the past 5 centuries is by putting natures of all kinds, human natures as well, to work for free or low cost. So that's a question of cheap nature. How do you find and secure and produce and mobilize cheap natures? But also that every movement of the accumulation of massive amounts of capital, of money, of these gigantic piles of money that now sit on the tables of the global casino, as it were, that every one of those movements also involves a nonlinear movement towards more and more toxification. And that means you got to put the poisons, you got to put the waste somewhere else. You got to move it off the account books, and you have to stop it from killing the most valuable workers that you have. And that strategy's worked really well for about 4 or 5 centuries. It's not working anymore. Climate change is now feeding back into the account books of global capital, if you will. That climate change is inducing rising costs of healthcare. You know, we've all read about Zika. It is inducing the powerful yield-suppressing effects on the big 4 cereal crops in the world: rice, maize, wheat, and soybeans. And it is beginning to feed back onto the cost accounting of capital, which sounds terribly boring. It sounds terribly boring to me, and I study it, but it's absolutely important that we have to understand that capitalism is a system of not paying your bills and of putting natures to work for free. Both of those movements are now coming to an end because there are no more frontiers, and the frontier itself is imploding as climate change, mass extinction, and other dynamics, the deepening crisis of the world's oceans, come to feed back on the capital accumulation process. So we need to come to terms with this deeper history, this 5-century history of capitalism as a powerful environment-making civilization, and to get outside of the mythology of capitalism as an economic system. Some people say, oh, Moore says that it's the Capitalocene, not the Anthropocene, and that's just wrong because it just says economics determine everything. Well, guess what? The very idea, the very term economy, national economy, wasn't invented until the 20th century. And that at every point, capitalism worked not because it was a market system that generalized everything, but because market exchange and production for the market was always contained within very definite spaces, islands of commodity production and exchange within oceans of cheap or potentially cheap natures of the 4 cheaps of labor, food, energy, and raw materials were out there for the taking. Yes, they were always contested, but for centuries, empires and capitalists won the day. All right, so what happened? How do we know this? How do we know that there was this massive transition between feudal Europe and early modern Europe? Well, I'm going to walk you through that, but here's the headlines. The scale, the scope, and the speed of environmental change shifted often by an order of magnitude between late medieval Europe, say in the 14th century on the eve of the Black Death and massive climate change, and the 16th century when the conquest of the Americas was underway, when the colonization and semi-colonial relations of subordinating the Baltic and Eastern Europe, when the movements into the Indian Ocean were taking place, and that what took feudal Europe centuries to achieve could happen in mere decades under capitalism. This is my favorite factoid when I talk about this because it really drives home the point. In northeastern France and Picardy, it took 2 centuries to clear 12,000 hectares of forest. 4 centuries later in northeastern Brazil, at the height of the sugar boom, it took 1 year to clear 12,000 hectares. So this did not rely, obviously, on the motive power of fossil fuels, although fossil fuels were implicated on the other side of the Atlantic. The Dutch had peat, which, of course, they dug up and quickly exhausted. The English had coal, which they started, has a very long history, and you can go back to medieval Europe and see coal mining. But the coal revolution in England starts in 1530. So the coal revolution is not... fossil capital is not an invention of the 19th century. It's an invention of the 16th century. That is, it's an invention of capitalism. And so, but what about feudalism? And I just want to touch on this because neo-Malthusian arguments in the Jared Diamond tradition and many others, Evan Fraser and many others make this argument. Well, feudal Europe is sort of the poster child for the overpopulation argument. In fact, this is entirely false, and neither Diamond nor Fraser nor any of these other folks actually study medieval Europe. And the consensus, and I'm finishing a book up on this right now, that medieval Europe, feudal Europe, was by no means overpopulated in the neo-Malthusian sense. It wasn't straight. Its carrying capacity was not stretched to the breaking point, but rather the problem was one of feudal class relations, and essentially the feudal ruling classes, the seigneurs, could have taken a smaller slice of the surplus and allowed for a reorganization of agrarian life. And that would have allowed for either a long plateau or a long gradual decline. But ruling classes are never smart like that. Once they get to the end of their life after 4 or 5 centuries, they become fixated on their own reproduction and they lose a sense of historical vision. I mean, that's why the world bourgeoisies today are completely incapable of dealing with climate change, even though it's a dagger at their heart. So, in thinking about this era, the rise of capitalism, that we need to come to grips with not only what's usually called the economic dynamism of it, its technological prodigiousness, its capacity to extend markets, its capacity to use financial instruments to increase capital accumulated, but also the development of what I'll call new techniques after Mumford. That is new forms, new ensembles of power, of knowledge, technology, and nature to appropriate the unpaid work of human and extra-human natures. The case of slavery, of course, is a very powerful instance of this, but also the radical expulsion of women from society in early modern Europe, as we've seen in the work of Silvia Federici and many other feminist scholars and feminist historians, that there was a crucial moment of the reconstitution of race and gender relations in powerfully modern ways that expelled women and peoples of color and from membership in humanity, indeed, or certainly expelled from full membership in that. So that means that when we think about capitalism, and this is very much true today, and it's running into big problems today, it's not just the old story of the exploitation of wage work. In fact, if capitalism were ever dependent on only the exploitation of wage work, nobody could ever make a profit. That's why colonialism and imperialism are so important. And those processes are there's never social imperialism and environmental imperialism. No, it's the same thing. They're wrapped up in different processes, different ways of putting human and extra-human work together. But we need to understand that capitalism does not run by mere economic processes alone. That every act of exploitation in the old-fashioned Marxist sense depends on an even grander movement of appropriating the cheap natures that are out there: labor, food, energy, and raw materials. And that, indeed, is the long history of capitalism, not merely as a system that periodically has to go out and find frontiers, but capitalism is premised on the frontier. That if capitalism ever had to reproduce itself within its own boundaries, that it would go broke. It wouldn't make a profit. And that's why the subtitle to my book is Ecology and the Accumulation of Capital, because this is quite correctly the argument we get from Rosa Luxemburg, the pioneering Marxist of the early 20th century. And that what we saw in this era, and I'm going to walk through a bit of it, is a very powerful churning of space and nature and work and power in one region after another, after another, after another. And so you can walk through the major commodities, primary commodities of the world. Many of these are still primary commodities without which the world could not form. But I give this graphic for a specific reason. Not that you can know that Sao Tome was at the top of the world's sugar economy in the 1550s, but because it tells us something that capitalism did that no other civilization had done, which was to essentially run through one frontier zone after another in rapid-fire succession to take advantage of the unpaid work of humans and the rest of nature in each different landing spot. So it moved to one, to the other, to the other. And oh, by the way, for all those who like to say, well, this wasn't really capitalism, this was merchant capitalism, at every stop, and this is the story of sugar, but we could do the story for mining, we could do it for timber, we could do it for any number of sectors, technological development followed at every stop on this path. And as I've been emphasizing, this was not merely a question of landscape, of exhausting soils, of cutting down forests, but of appropriating the human natures in the form of African slaves to make sugar work. And if there was ever a crop in the history of the modern world that caused more misery than anything else, it was sugar, because it was bound to slavery. So commodity frontiers are so important to keep in the center of our thinking about capitalism, because they secure the cheap natures, the cheap food, energy, raw materials, and labor that are so necessary for this weird system of capitalism to go on. That capitalism is above all a system that defines labor productivity very, very narrowly. It excludes most humanly productive work, especially the work of raising children and making communities and all the kind of institutions of social reproduction that are so necessary. It defines labor productivity so narrowly and then tries to then accumulates wealth on that basis and defers the benefits of that because it's always betting on the future. It's a system of temporal deferment at the same time. So there is always this futuristic imaginary in capitalism, and that's why technology has such a powerful hold on our imagination. But one of the things that we need to see is that even at this early point that before capitalism, commerce had always followed people, and this was the case in medieval Europe and some China and many other places around the world. The rising population led to new settlement, people moved out to the frontier, and then commerce followed. But that logic has turned precisely inside out in the era of capitalism. That for the first time in human history on a massive scale, that people follow commerce, that population, the laws of population get remade in very, very powerful ways. And this is, of course, an element of the present biospheric crisis. It's not population in the Malthusian sense, which is abstracted from history, but rather in a deeply historical and geographical sense that, of course, population is always implicated. And so what I've urged is that we really look hard at this language of technology that we've inherited and that so many of us, including myself, have often used. That yes, there is technology, but it's always embedded within a technics. And this comes, again, from Mumford, that as he points out, other civilizations were much more advanced than the Europeans. They had machines, he writes, but they did not develop the machine. And indeed, capitalist technology in its most powerful sense, you can think of the steam engine, the internal combustion engine, but also early in the history of capitalism, the cartography, map-making, and shipbuilding revolutions. The epoch-making technological advances have always been premised on the frontier. Where did the steam engine develop first? It developed at the pit heads of coal mines to drain water. It was fantastically inefficient. It could only be developed where the subterranean frontier, if you will, was so rich that technological development was possible. Each one of these technologies really feeds off of the massive appropriation of unpaid work of humans and the rest of nature. And so what I am urging is that we think of power and nature, technology and knowledge as an organic whole at every turn. This is, of course, an echo of Marx reminding us, and it's often forgotten, that production as a whole is distribution and circulation, production and exchange all at the same time. And so what this means is that global conquest, commodification, and appropriation were all wrapped up with each other in the rise of capitalism, in an extraordinary movement of imperialism, but also of technological innovation and capital accumulation. And the second passage here that I have emboldened here is to point out that in making an abstraction of nature, that humans in the era of capitalism, that is, particular humans, made abstractions of themselves. So this, of course, is a return to longstanding Marxist concerns around alienation. All right, so now we're going to sort of quickly walk through what was this revolution. Well, first of all, you had a powerful agricultural revolution in the Low Countries. This was first. England didn't come first. I'm sorry. It just didn't. And then was followed by the English by 1550, who learned to farm from, well, you guessed it, from the Dutch. And that this was distinctive from previous agricultural revolutions. It was distinctive from, say, the feudal agricultural revolution of the 9th and 10th centuries, in that it expelled labor from production, and that it said what matters is not the productivity of the land, but how many bushels of rye or wheat could you grow with a given hour of agricultural labor, with a given average hour. And what this did was to provide one of the pillars of an extraordinary environment-making revolution. Landscapes were cleared, canals were built, wetlands across Europe were drained, which was always an attack on peasant forms of livelihood, peasant forms of communal society, so on and so forth. That in this era, there was in Central Europe something that's absolutely forgotten but lives on in our thinking in terms of mining and metallurgy and the Great Peasant War of 1525. It's called the Peasant War, but in fact it was a great era of working class unrest centered in the mining boom towns of Central Europe. And in this era, the great mining centers, by the way, we get Dollar from Jakmishtal, the great Czech-German mining town of this era. The landscapes, the forests of Central Europe were completely transformed from old hardwoods into fast-growing conifers, and that many both proponents and critics of this metallurgical capitalism complained of profound poisoning of the streams, though the fish would no longer come around, that the air was choking with pollution. This was also the era in which we see the emergence of this sugar slavery nexus, which has to be understood as not only deeply oppressive and brutal towards human and extra-human life, but is also the historical genesis of what we call industrial agriculture today. If we want to understand cash crop agriculture and monocultures, we have to go to the Atlantic Islands and to northeastern Brazil in the 15th and 16th centuries. As I pointed out, that this was always, and in every case, a movement not just of transforming landscapes and forests, but also of reorganizing humans so that they could provide either paid work or unpaid work to the engine of capital accumulation. That in the 1570s, you have what was probably the first major reorganization of 1.5 million people in the Andes around the principle that was called in the era of the Vietnam War strategic hamlets. It turns out strategic hamlets go back to the 16th century, and it also turns out, I've been learning, that the Spanish didn't develop these, but or originate these. That was played out much earlier in Ireland. But that what you had in the Andes was this radical recomposition of life as a whole, human and extra-human life, in order to supply energy and labor power and raw materials to the great mines of Potosí. What did they make? Well, they made silver. Why was silver necessary? Because nobody wanted to count on pieces of paper. And here's a crucial point that we need to keep in mind, that world money, even though it appears to be floating around the ether, and the world banking system reproduces that both materially and in our imagination, it always depends on something quite material. And in this case, it was silver. In Southeast Asia, we saw, in the early 17th century, we saw again the most brutal forms of colonial practice, the wholesale execution of the inhabitants of the Banda Islands. It was so brutal that Adam Smith and Karl Marx totally agreed on this. The Dutch were by far the most brutal colonial power they had seen. Of course, they must not have been studying up on the Spaniards, but in any event. And oh yes, what do the Spaniards call when they're the indigenous peoples across South America? Naturales. They call them part of nature, the better that they could be treated cheaply. So this process of this churning geographical process goes on and on and on in almost every element of social, economic, and cultural life in early modern Europe, that it was a story again and again of transforming forests, of going to the Americas to build their ships, which the Spanish do. They build a third of their fleet by 1700, especially in Havana, but in the Caribbean. The Portuguese go as far afield as Goa in India and Salvador da Bahia in northeastern Brazil. And that we saw as well, this is not merely, a lot of times when we think about the rise of the West and the rise of capitalism, we think of this as very much a story of colonialism in the Americas, but it wasn't merely that. It was also the semi-colonial subordination of the Baltic. And the Slavs were not Europe. Poland was not part of Europe at this time. They were savages. This is the discourse of the Dutch and the British and every other Central and Western European power in this era. And indeed, what we saw in Poland along the Vistula Basin, which is a vast basin as big as the Rhine, or even bigger, was deforested at precisely the same moment and in precisely the same speed and scale as the Brazilian Atlantic rainforest, which was absolutely mowed down in the 17th century. And oh yeah, once Poland's agriculture is completely exhausted and can no longer yield a surplus, its physical surplus falls by half in the 17th century. The diet of Poles absolutely suffers. Heights decline. There's a constant state of semi-starvation. So this is about diets and bodies, no less than landscapes and markets. That when Poland's breadbasket is no longer good, England takes over by 1700. But England's day in the sun lasts for about 50 years, and then almost overnight, in the blink of an eye, by 1760, its exports collapse by 90%. Indeed, very soon, England is in the throes of a massive food price crisis. So serious was this crisis that even 50 years later, when David Ricardo was writing, that he was absolutely terrified that rising food prices, high food prices, would undermine British industrialization. So again, there's this question, this ongoing churning of food and agriculture and cheap food. And cheap food is so important because it determines the price of labor power, and the price of labor power determines the possibilities of capital accumulation. And this story goes on and on and on, that it is a story of the massive extermination of fur-bearing animals across Siberia, across North America, the development of colonial infrastructures all across those zones, but especially in North America, that it's the movement of whaling and fishing fleets all across the Atlantic, and successive waves of overfishing. The fisheries collapse and then they move on. And then again, the maturing of these processes, as in the modern sugar revolution in the Caribbean. If we want to understand the origins of the Industrial Revolution, we need to understand that the prototype really for large-scale labor organization and discipline and rationalization was the sugar plantation of Barbados and Jamaica and the integrated field and mill system in the 17th centuries. And oh yeah, by the way, that repatriated profits from the West Indies to England constituted somewhere between 20 and 33% of capital formation in the 1770s and 1780s. That is, the capital that built the Industrial Revolution came from the sugar mills many places away. European bodies, if they weren't prosperous burghers or aristocrats, absolutely suffered. This was a long era of the transformation of diets, which, as we know from talking about food justice, food politics, food sustainability today, is completely implicated in the world conjuncture of the 21st century. But this was also the era of what really came to the aid of this food regime was not just technical innovation. That was a big deal, but it was also really the recreation of Pangea for the first time in 150, 175 million years after 1492, which gave Europe two great things, potatoes and maize. And what do? Well, they double the caloric output with basically no increase in labor inputs, and allow for, they're essentially what Marx and Engels called a free gift that just fell into the lap of European capitalists. So these, and not coincidentally, these would come to the rescue of European capitalism when it was in the midst of a profound agroecological depression in the late 18th and early 19th century, a depression that ultimately really was resolved in part through potatoes and maize, but also through the rise of American capitalist agriculture in the Midwest after 1840. So what do we need to put together? Well, we need to put together revolution in commodity production, revolutions in markets, all that economic stuff, revolutions in political power, but also revolutions in ways of seeing and thinking the world around us. The rise of capitalism and that capitalism itself is a kind of ontological and epistemological revolution. It is a revolutionary system in terms of what do we know and what do we think exists, what are the categories of existence? And of course, the big categories of existence for capitalism are humanity and nature, or society and nature. And so fundamental to this was, as that indicates, is that nature was external, space was flat, time was linear, and this gives us that's obviously a very crude simplification in some ways, but also absolutely necessary if we continue to think of the history of capitalism as merely economic. I think that we are going to disable our politics and undermine our politics, because we need to understand that bourgeois civilization has given us very powerful tools with which to work, that they are not all bad, but that they are also very limited. And one of the most powerful examples of this that I can give in terms of contemporary discussion of the environmental crisis is that we continue to talk about nature as if it's eternal and somehow out there, that it's nature in general. And I think one of the great contributions of Marx was to tell us that history matters, that the radical historicization of concepts matters. So if we want to understand production since the 1970s, we would have a historical conception of production to understand the global transformations of subcontracting, of the rise of the global factory and all the rest of it. Well, there's been nothing that compares to that in terms of the thinking about nature. It's almost like as if nobody talked about neoliberal production anymore. They just said, oh, production in general. That's just production in general. That's how we still talk about nature. But in fact, the history of science, of culture, of states and empires around what nature means and what gets to be treated as part of nature and what gets to be treated as part of society, these are fundamental issues of race, class, and gender, and in the web of life in the modern world. I just want to flag a few big points on the way out of here, that as I've indicated, that money and world silver were linked, but this is an enduring pattern, that world money, world nature, and world power are always fit together. So even these abstract questions of financialization have to be linked to definite ways of organizing the web of life. So as I like to say, it's Wall Street as a way of organizing nature. All right, so this will give us, in terms of grounding this a little bit, I just want to show you this map. This is a TO map. Maybe some of you have seen this before. This was a perfectly functional map during the time of the Crusades. But it's not very functional if you want to, say, go and conquer the world and organize shipping to transfer goodies from one part of the world, or human beings in the form of slaves from one part of the world to another. You need a map that looks like this. This, of course, is the Mercator projection, the most familiar projection that we have. Of course, it's totally an imperialist projection for all sorts of reasons. I love it because it's called Mercator, which of course is the Latin for merchant. And then I like to say this wasn't just an era of merchant capitalism. This, of course, comes from 1569. But Mercator himself was not only a cartographer, but a kind of industrial capitalist who produced globes for sale in northwestern Europe. So this, and this will start to wrap up now, is that we need to start thinking about nature society not just as analytical problems. It's not just a problem of language. It's that nature and society are abstractions that are treated as real. They are abstractions with real material force in the world. And I've talked a lot about nature as with an uppercase N as a way of organizing the world, but also society. When does the English language word society in its general sense come into play? Well, it comes into play in the 1550s. What's happening then in England? Well, the defeat of Kett's Rebellion, the high tide of agrarian insurgency against capitalist transformation. That's 1549. The onset, as I mentioned, of the English Coal Revolution after 1530. England's non-agricultural population and urban population starts to grow very, very fast, twice as fast as the agricultural population. And Oh yeah, the intensification of English rule in Ireland, that society in its general sense, in English society, American society, this is embedded in a violent and colonial history. So I like this. The Earl of Northampton writes to Henry VIII. He says, we have to draw all the wild Irish that dwell now dispersed in the woods and resettle them into towns, into strategic hamlets, so that we can monitor them, control them, put them to work. The Dutch do this, the Spanish do this again and again and again. And if you look at the ways that the English or the Dutch or the Spanish or any of these imperialists are talking about colonized people, it all goes back to a sorting out of who gets to be part of humanity or who gets to be a part of society and who is really barbaric or wild or savage over here. And so this goes on again and again. And so I use the phrase of Nestor King, the great feminist critic, who likens this process of the expulsion of human beings from society, from humanity, as a form of human sacrifice. And she talks about the dramatic recomposition of gender relations across the capitalist world in the early modern era. This was also, of course, a process with African slaves, as I've said, that they were subjected to social death. That is, they were expelled from membership in society. And so that's hugely important when we think, well, do we want to talk about the world that we live in as anthropogenic or capitalogenic? Anthropogenic goes to a very definite colonial and capitalist and violent lineage of basically saying, okay, you guys and gals, you don't get to be part of humanity. You human beings, you aren't really human, or you're sort of human, but not fully. Maybe someday. There's this long and violent process. So I think that we need to come to terms with the way that our language has been structured by empire and capital. And so, as I like to say, well, you know, if we think historically, if we think that the origins of the problem are the Industrial Revolution, if we start the clock in 1784, we end up with a very different politics than if we start the clock in 1492. And by the way, it doesn't mean, starting the clock in the era of Columbus doesn't mean that we think the era of the Industrial Revolution, the first Industrial Revolution in Britain, the second Industrial Revolution of petrochemicals and auto and electrical industries, and then even the post-World War II transformations, and on and on and on. It doesn't mean we think those are unimportant, but we need to look at when do these relations of organizing humans and the rest of nature take place? When does this really begin to crystallize? And so what I would say, and it's a bit polemical, but I think that there's something to it. You know, if we think that the steam engines or the internal combustion engines are the problem, then shut down the technology. But if we think that the relations that gave rise to those technologies are the problems, then shut down those relations. And so, there you have it. Shut down the relations that made the coal plant and you can stop it for good. So how I want to conclude is this, that I think revolutionary politics has to stop drawing lines around whose work and whose lives matter and whose does not. And that goes beyond, that conception, I think, has to go beyond the conception of the human, and that we have to come to terms with the racist and gendered and unequal ways of organizing human beings that go on around that category of humanity. And that we need to say this, that environmentalist politics has been weak around the question of work. Marxist and socialist politics have always been good about work, but terrible about nature. We need to put those together. No politics of work without nature, no politics of nature without work. That we need to nurture conversations that are necessarily open-ended around how do we develop the forms of knowledge, artistic, social, scientific, and otherwise. How do we recast those categories themselves, those ways of knowing, so that we can develop forms of knowledge that are appropriate to the 21st century and not rely on 16th or 18th or 19th century conceptions of the world, and that we stop containing the politics of life and work within society. And here where I want to end is from the radical cleric Thomas Munzer. You may know him from Marx On the Jewish Question. And he says this very powerful thing. And by the way, Thomas Munzer was at the heart of this metallurgical capitalist boom in the early 16th century in Germany, in the German lands of this period. And he says the creatures too must become free. Thank you. And how should we facilitate the questions, or should I just, Okay, so why don't we take maybe 2 or 3 at a time? So I saw one hand back here and Louis over here, and we'll take it from there. All right, hi. Say it a little bit louder so we can all hear. Sorry. It's a great question. Louis? Well, I absolutely agree. Let me try to answer these in reverse order. Although I think that there is one linkage, which is that maybe I'll start with that. They're both great questions. One is that I think that the left has dealt with scarcity poorly. And certainly academic, environmental studies scholars have pretty much ignored it. As I touch on in my book, and I draw on the great political economist Michael Perlman in saying this, that Marx very much did understand there was such a thing as scarcity, but that it had to be historicized, and also that it had to be talked about from different perspectives. So scarcity, of course, scarcity is a normal condition of life under capitalism for the vast majority, because we have a rationing system premised on access to cash. So that's an ongoing reality. The question of revolutionary politics, I want to be careful not to sound too romantic or optimistic a note, but I would say looking at the history of revolutionary movements over the past 2-3 centuries or so, I think that you do see it's kind of a stepwise advance, but a kind of the development of a sense of global networks of solidarity and the development of forms of activism and social justice that escape the nation-state bond. And I think that we have that. I mean, the movement against the Vietnam War, of course, was a global struggle in many senses of that term. Solidarity movements in the United States that you've been active in, of course, have been tremendously inspirational to me. And then more recently, over the past 20 years, anti-sweatshop movements, various forms of labor solidarity, climate justice movements, food sovereignty and food justice movements, the World Social Forum, all these experiments have their problems. I realize that. I don't want to appear Pollyannish about this. But I think that we do live in a period of the reconstruction of something that looks like a global conversation, a global movement of the left, without romanticizing that or overstating it. I think it's still extremely tentative with lots of gaps and all of that. I think that the linkage has to do with a kind of old-fashioned Marxist argument, and the way that I'm going to put it might sound really funny, but just bear with me, is the exhaustion of capitalism's ability to develop the forces of production. And we see this in a number of important ways. That we were told in the 1970s that we would live now in an era of robot factories. Instead, we got the global sweatshop. So there's no great revolution in labor productivity. Very, very small and slow periods of growth. This is now even recognized by very mainstream economists like Robert Gordon, who's produced a useful book on this. We also see this in agriculture. And if anything, that's a more telling figure, that we are witnessing the ongoing slowdown of agricultural productivity. That's a problem because the whole possibility for all of us to be in this room right now is that an agricultural surplus of a fairly large dimension is produced. And it's not just that a large surplus is produced, but historically the trend of more and more calories, and yes, that's how capital defines food these days, more and more calories with less and less necessary labor time, that gap has to continue to grow and grow and grow and grow, and it is not, or it is growing very incrementally, which is a problem that goes far beyond agriculture, but it's fundamental because ultimately the price of food and the price of labor power go hand in hand. So that speaks to a kind of issue of scarcity. Now, about the Earth system scientists, I think I'm less sanguine about the Paris talks than maybe you are, but I would say that the Earth system scientists, absolutely, I mean, I'm not poking fun at them when I introduce the talk in this way. I think that we do need to recognize these are salient facts of our world today. Here's the problem with the Anthropocene and with the Earth system scientists, that they have a culture that says humanistic, artistic, social scientific knowledge of the world doesn't really matter. They've got it figured out. That's a problem. Clive Hamilton, who is not an Earth system scientist but really speaks in defense of them, says, Crutzen, one of the founders of the Anthropocene concept, Crutzen understood this all along, that it was capitalism in England and steam power, which tells us how impoverished their historical thinking is. And so, and not only that, but the technocratic solutions advocated by Earth system scientists, the IPCC establishment, is in itself a very dangerous anti-politics machine. That is, it reduces political questions to questions of management and sort of technocratic governance. And that seems to me profoundly dangerous for a lot of reasons, not least that it's undemocratic, but also that it's premised on a rationality that is really born of the European Enlightenment. There are lots of good elements to this, but it is a rationality of fragments. It is not a rationality of wholes. This is the point that Elmar Altvater, the great German Marxist... the track record of that is... the record of that is extremely uneven, and the reliance on technological fixes in that sense of technological, I mean, I have a lot of respect for what you're saying here, and I want to respectfully disagree that the problems of so-called anthropogenic climate change are, first of all, those of capital, and second of all, if they are anthropogenic, it's not from people in the global south. It's from the concentrations of wealth and in the world, and there's been fairly significant... I think that this is the beginning of an important conversation. Back there?
I would say, as a biologist, I think a lot of natural sciences do not grasp the nature of the social nature of nature. And this is what Jason's trying to do for us. And I think we should really take our time to see. Because I think we have a scientism that basically divorces us from this broader issue that is, in essence, the history of humanity and, at this point, Earth. So the right side baseball. I'm wearing baseball cap, so I'll take the extra base. I would say John Bellamy Foster's Metabolic Rift and your integrated historical landscapes are not necessarily in opposition. I think very much. I view it as kind of a parallax vantage point. We're both looking at the same object from two different vantage points, different backgrounds. And it seems like one's looking at how capitalism works, and the other one's looking at how capitalism doesn't work. And
Exactly.
in some ways, if you look at Capital One, it's like that division's in there too. The first half dealt with the kind of abstract view of capitalism. The second half is these wonderful short essays on how agriculture arose in Britain in very almost reportage, the way it talks about it. So they're actually wonderful. Now, the second point I want to make is that you spoke of this kind of parallelism between capital and nature, almost to the point that they become a kind of composite object. But, if you can imagine the two space, some parts of the space are in parallel, and other parts are orthogonal. And I think you're going to understand where I'm coming from in a minute. But if you look at, for instance, influenza, there's an example in which once the agribusiness industrialized that introduction, they also industrialized the pathogens. But the pathogens aren't necessarily cooperating with either capitalists or proletarians. They're on their own evolutionary agenda. So, I'll just leave it at that.
First of all, I totally agree. We'll take one more question, but what you said is just the most beautiful and clear statement of what I've been trying to get at. That there's an element in which nature as a whole is. I mean, obviously there are patterns, but there's also powerful nonlinear moments, especially in the present, that enter in ways that can't be read off the history of capitalism, for instance, but can't be understood abstracted from that. We had one other hand up. Yeah.
So just going off what you just said, you referred to it as a nonlinear pattern. You don't see that as a system, the way that a virus might evolve over time, or I think John Bellamy Foster's example was a coral reef can continue bleaching with its own system as a reaction to an initial action, but that functions as a sort of system.
I think that's absolutely right, that there are layers within layers, and that life as human relations are mosaics of combined and uneven development that are full of surprises as well. And yeah, about John Bellamy Foster, I mean, his reaction to me recently is quite surprising, to be honest, because I've actually made a strong argument that his elaboration of metabolism in Marx's ecology, which was premised not on a break or a separation of nature and society, later it became that in his language and that of the Metabolic Rift School, but was premised on the antagonism of town and country, of bourgeois and proletarian, and a reorganization of nature, which seemed to me a quite powerful formulation that I took as my own point of departure. So I agree with you, and I think that indeed for John, the central question is the ongoing breakdown of Earth's systems. And I think that's an entirely necessary, important argument that we need. And I've done nothing to suggest that that's misguided. In fact, I think I took it as my own point of departure. Thank God we don't all have to do everything that everybody else does, right? We can exist in an ongoing conversation that's a division of labor. So I'm a bit taken aback at the strenuous, the kind of old, reminded me of sort of old-fashioned Spartacus League polemics or something. So, and I'm also very taken by Marxists who want to draw lines around Marxism, like It's not like there are a lot of Marxists out there. Maybe we should be looking for avenues of cooperation and conversation rather than kicking people out of the in-group. And your point about disease, yes, absolutely. I agree 1,000%. And indeed, my whole position has been to show in a lot of ways that in one way, yes, capitalism is a kind of conglomerate, if that's the right term, or a kind of assemblage, but that it always exists within the web of life, and that whatever human structures, especially one so unequal, so rapacious as capitalism, whenever we see structures like that, they are profoundly vulnerable and not resilient at all. So instead of seeing nature subsumed within capitalism, I see quite the opposite. But there's a tension between the two. Everyone's hot and sweaty. Wants to go get a cold beer. Sounds good to me. Do we have any other questions?
Yeah, I do.
No? One more? Do we have time?
Yeah, it's quick work on.
Okay. I'll make it quick and then let everyone go and we can talk individually. Is that a good deal? Yeah.
Sure. Do you have propositions for new ways of talking about the things that we call nature?
Yes.
Okay. Like specific language?
Well, one of them is the web of life. People say, well, Jason, why did you call your book Capitalism in the Web of Life? Web of life, what does that mean? Look, at a certain level, it's just poetics. It's a way of unsettling. If you say capitalism in nature, everybody knows or thinks they know what you're saying. So I think that we need to have conceptual ways of talking, conceptual vocabulary that really work, and that's going to be an emergent process. So it's not, and I walked a fine line in the book, and some people say I did it okay, and some people say I didn't do it okay. But to say, okay, here's some ways of talking about how humans work in nature and how nature works in humans that might be a starting point. And so what I say in the first page of the book is this is an invitation to conversation, because the emergence of new vocabularies, new ways of thinking is going to be emergent, and we're going to need all different epistemological, ontological ways of approaching this question at our disposal. We need all the help we can get. Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Thank you.